Intentional misrepresentation. Intentional misrepresentation is important to understand in your Torts 2 class, and more importantly, in the multi-state when you are focused on training for the bar. Lastly, intentional misrepresentation is important to understand even if you're a layperson in the community who is not in law school and who is not studying for the bar. Because a lot of people think they know what this means by law, but they don't. We are going to walk through this element by element. There are 5 key elements here in order to understand what intentional misrepresentation means. So let's dive into it. There must be a misrepresentation by the defendant, which means that the defendant made a past or present fact to the plaintiff. An example of this is that A wants to sell B a car. And A tells B, hey B, the engine on this car works perfectly. There are no issues with the car. When you drive it, it should work reasonably, perfectly, and it will purr like a lion. B says, okay, A, I'll buy the car. That is an example of the defendant making a material fact to the plaintiff. Where element number 1 gets tricky is when the defendant makes an opinion rather than a past or material fact here. So let's say that A tells B that this is the best looking car in the lot, that this car will get you a lot of attention. You look good in this car, B. Come buy it. That is an example of an opinion. That is not a past or material fact. That is given to B. That is A giving B a compliment, basically puffery. That is an opinion. So that's how you establish element number 1. Element number 2 is very critical here because element number 2 really gets into scienter. And scienter really means that the defendant had knowledge of the falsity. The key word is knowledge. That the defendant knew that the misrepresentation made to the plaintiff was false. Okay? The defendant had the desire. The defendant had, again, knowledge that what he or she said to the plaintiff was false. Or, it could be either or the defendant had reckless disregard to his truth and falsity. Basically, the defendant being very careless by trying to figure out whether the material fact given to the plaintiff was true or false. So either or is very critical here. That is what scienter gets into. That's really where the defendant intentionally makes a past or material fact that is false to the plaintiff. That's scienter. Element number 3 is that the defendant had the intent. The defendant had the intent to induce the plaintiff's reliance. The defendant wanted the plaintiff to rely on his or her statement. That is what element number 3 really means. So again, it's a situation where the defendant made a factual statement to the plaintiff. The defendant knew that it was false or had reckless disregard to its truth or falsity. And the defendant also had the intent to induce the plaintiff's reliance on that false statement. Okay? Basically, A trying to sell B a messed up car that doesn't work properly. Okay, and in 2 weeks, the car breaks down. The defendant's wanted to make some quick money. So the defendant had the intent to induce the plaintiff's reliance in order to make some quick cash, right? This is an example of what this means. Element number 4 gets into the plaintiff had justifiable reliance. The plaintiff had justifiable reliance on the misrepresentation made by the defendant. So, example, if the plaintiff is a layperson in society and doesn't really know much about cars, and the defendant is an engineer or the defendant is a car salesman at a dealership, and purchases that car, right, that we were talking about with A and B, and that's an example of the plaintiff having reasonable, justifiable reliance on the defendant's statement. However, let's say the plaintiff is an engineer, him or herself. If the plaintiff is an engineer and still gets tricked by the defendant's false statement, it's going to be very hard to prove that the plaintiff had justifiable reliance, because this is needed here. This is really needed here, because the plaintiff should have known that the car's engine was messed up by either checking the engine, him or herself, or hiring another person to check the car for him or herself, right? That's why justifiable reliance is going to be very hard to prove here if the plaintiff is experienced in dealing with cars. Another example is, let's say the defendant makes a false representation to the plaintiff about the law, and the plaintiff happens to be a lawyer who's been practicing for 5 to 10 years. The plaintiff can't turn around and sue the defendant, because the plaintiff should have known that the defendant was making a false representation of the law, because the plaintiff, him or herself, is an attorney who studied the law, took the bar, passed the bar, and has been practicing for over 5 to 10 years. Therefore, it will be very hard for the plaintiff to say that, oh, I justifiably relied on what the defendant said, right? So the key thing here is going to be whether the plaintiff is experienced and knowledgeable about what's being said in intentional misrepresentation. And lastly, it's very straightforward here, that the plaintiff needs to suffer damages. An example is that, with the car example, is that the plaintiff spent money in order to buy that car, right? The defendant told plaintiff that, hey, the engine is working perfectly fine. When you drive it, it should work well. 2 weeks later, the car breaks down, and the plaintiff just spent all this money on the car that he or she bought from the defendant. And also, the plaintiff more than likely had to fix that car in order to make the car work well again to a mechanic. So we have all these expenses for the plaintiff to go through, and that is an example of damages that has been caused to the plaintiff based on what the defendant stated to the plaintiff. So quick review here. Intentional misrepresentation, that the defendant made a past or present fact, not an opinion, but a factual statement to the plaintiff, and the defendant had scienter, that the defendant knew the falsity of that statement or had reckless disregard to its truth or falsity. The defendant wanted to induce the plaintiff's reliance on that false statement in order to trick that person or get money from that person, or whatever the situation is. The key thing for element number 3 is that the defendant intended to induce the plaintiff's reliance. The plaintiff must have justified reliance on the misrepresentation made by the defendant. So the plaintiff truly relied on what the defendant stated. The plaintiff wasn't knowledgeable and experienced in whatever they're talking about here. The plaintiff was just an innocent person. Example of damages, again, is that the plaintiff spent money on the car and had to pay even more money in order to get it fixed by a mechanic. That is what damages really means under intentional misrepresentation. So that is intentional misrepresentation. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. And again, this is very critical for multiple choice. I'll be very surprised if you get this on the exam. However, it's possible to see it in multiple choice. So it's important to understand these 5 elements in order to be fully prepared for any exam that you may face, or any real life situation you may face as well. Thank you so much.